Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 9 class. We're in Unit 3, Global Interactions, Section 2, The Rise of the West, Part P, The Renaissance and the Resurgence of Europe, roughly 1300s to 1500s. Our main self-test questions: what were the causes of the Renaissance in Europe? What is humanism, and what are examples of it as seen during the Renaissance? Who were some of the artists of the Renaissance, and what were their major works? What was the printing press, and in what ways did it change Europe forever? What was the Renaissance? Well, the Renaissance increasingly has come under historical scrutiny. Was it an actual thing? No one was going outside and being like, hey, Ma, the Renaissance is happening. Let's get out there. It's more of a historical label that historians have placed on this time period. And I think it could be considered a golden age of Europe, focusing on arts, literature, and sciences, specifically in Western Europe, starting in the south and spreading its way northward to countries such as France, Flanders, and eventually the Kingdom of England, Scotland, etc. Renaissance as a term means rebirth. What is it a rebirth of? Well, many historians say it's a rebirth of classical learning, that Greek and Roman philosophy, art, and sciences are going to be revived in Europe after the period we call the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages. The Renaissance was initially centered in Italy, but it spread eventually to the north in Europe in the 15 and 1600s, and its legacy can be seen throughout museums and artworks and concepts that we have as part of a Western tradition, just as much as Christianity or just as much as other elements of what we consider Western civilizations. So why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? Well, one, Italy, which is not a country at this time yet, in fact, it won't be a country until about 1870, but it has a great central coastal location in the middle of the Mediterranean. The same reason why the Romans were able to expand outward from Italy and conquer most of the Mediterranean Sea, making it into their empire. Another reason the Renaissance began there is during the 1200s, we see the rise of a large number of successful and powerful trading cities. From Venice to Florence to Genoa, these cities, and really just city-states, not just cities, but empires and kingdoms in their own right, became economically, politically, and socially very powerful and had great influence over Western civilization. Italy was kind of at a loci point of growth, trade, and cultural diffusion from the Crusades, with both returning crusaders returning through Italy to their other parts, as well as merchants who expanded outwards from these powerful Italian city-states and bringing new ideas, new cultures, or bringing back texts on ancient ideas, such as those of the Greeks and the Romans. This exchange of trade and people led to the spread of ideas. And another reason why is all of this trade brought great wealth and led to the rise of a very wealthy merchant class. You might remember kind of the idea of burghers and townspeople from the commercial revolution. And powerful Italian politicians and leaders became patrons of the arts. This means they used their wealth to commission or pay for artwork and supported the artists financially, leading to, well, more artists being created during this time period. The Renaissance is also considered unique because it is the rebirth, or really the birth, of a new worldview in Western Europe that we call humanism. Humanism is incredibly complex as an idea. There are multiple humanist philosophers who have different theories on exactly what humanism is, but I'll give you some of the main ideas here of humanism. One, secularism, that humanism supports non-religious ideas. This doesn't mean that these early humanists were not Christian, which was, again, the dominant religion, Roman Catholicism. No, it just means that their focus of humanism and focus on humanism didn't always necessarily have to do with the religious ideas of hell, sin, heaven, etc. You're going to have non-religious ideas, non-religious worldviews be part of this humanism. It's a focus on the importance of the individual and individual thought, that your ideas as an educated individual matter. There'll be an increased focus on life on earth. Like the medieval Christian worldview was, this world doesn't really matter. This world is tough, this world is hard, but if you're a good Christian and you say your prayers and you act righteously, your main focus is getting into heaven. Humanism says, well, sure, that's an important life goal as well, but we can also focus on this life here. This life, this 30, 40, 50, 60, however many years we are given, we can do great things. We can improve ourselves. We can be knowledgeable. We can make great leaps of inference and understanding. That we should also, as individuals, focus on this life here on earth and make it great. It is also characterized by a revival of Greek and Roman learning, right? The classics, we talked about how the Muslims preserved the classics, the Byzantine Empire preserved these classical writings, and these writings then make their way back to Italy after kind of being forgotten or in some cases lost from the Byzantine Empire, from contact with the Islamic kingdoms and the caliphates. And then people have renewed interest in them, reading the ancient Roman philosophers, reading the ancient Greek philosophers of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Humanism focuses on individual achievement, that you are capable of incredible things or just expanding your capabilities as an individual. Like if you don't change the world, that's okay as long as you develop yourself as an individual, as you always try to learn, you always try to improve yourself and take pride in the achievements you are able to create. Don't do just the minimum to get by. Do whatever you can to achieve and to grow as a person, using ancient learning to understand your own world and life and see it through these other lenses, while also acknowledging your own capability to create your own lens from which to view life. And basically, it says all people can improve themselves by learning and working in this life. And you're not as necessarily focused on doom and gloom in the afterlife and what is to become of me. One of the most pivotal works that kind of represent this idea is Raphael's School of Athens, which is a painting in the Papal Palace in Rome. And you have all these famous Greek and Roman philosophers, mathematicians, geologists, geographers, who are kind of contemplating the wonders of the world in all of its glory. So you have this kind of concept of academic freedom conflict, secular humanism. Man created God as a projection of his own mind, so the mind of man guides morality, where the traditional Christian worldviews, God means mankind as his own image, and we should only follow the Bible and the principles of biblical morality. So there's that kind of difference between these two things. Humanism is found as a concept throughout Renaissance art. You have a massive number of commissioned pieces of art, and many of them are in religious nature. A lot of this Renaissance art does focus on your religion. You're like, well, how is it secular then, Mr. Campbell? Well, a lot of it's evident in the specific stories that are told. I mean, you have the creation of Adam by God, which was a work by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. And while, yes, mankind is depicted as slightly lower, there is an equality in this touch, this spark of divinity, the idea that the divine is in each and every human being. Let us try to become and represent that spark of divinity through righteousness and through improvement throughout our lives. The story of David, a key story of the Old Testament, this idea that David was an individual, was a human, wasn't an angel, wasn't an avatar of God. He was a human being, but through personal achievement, he was able to accomplish great things, specifically the slaying of a major enemy, Goliath, to his people. And while he might have been empowered by God, it was the individual that did this action. That's why, like, almost every single major artist of the Renaissance period took their own crack at this whole story of David and Goliath. And you also saw the commissioning of artworks that didn't necessarily revolve around great historical figures or even great biblical figures. Some of these wealthy merchants and rulers and princes also commissioned artwork that celebrated their own achievements. These are two brothers within a powerful merchant family, and they had this painting commissioned of themselves. That's something you generally wouldn't see before the Renaissance period, people asking for paintings of just themselves. And around this painting, they are depicted in their finest clothing, which was what people wore at the time, fur lined robes of various exotic and luxurious cloths. They're depicted showing all their personal achievements, a knowledge of geography, capability of reading and writing, musical skills, all these different skills that they thought they represented. The Italian Renaissance and the Renaissance as a whole was also an artistic revolution. Paintings became considerably more realistic, and I apologize that the power of PowerPoint, as it were, and the capabilities of technology can't render these in greater perfection. They look a little grainy and gritty, but they're not. This is much more realistic painting, much more realistic sculpture than we saw during the Middle Ages. It is, however, sculptures based on the classical ideas. Remember, these Roman and Greek statues also tried to depict the human body with every muscle sticking out that is anatomically correct. And so that classicism comes back and is revived during this Renaissance period. But they also develop new techniques. So they're building on the concepts and innovations of the ancients, the Greeks and the Romans, but they have new techniques such as perspective. Perspective says, let's create a point in this painting, in this work of art, and we'll draw all lines to it. And in doing so, the viewer of this piece of art makes it seems much more real to them, much more exacting to them than if we looked at, art from the 800s, 900s, 11th century CE. You would say, well, it's not super great. Some of it's beautiful, but a lot of it's like kind of mediocre-ish, at least by our maybe modern standards. They used new types of paints and oil-based painting that allowed them to paint with greater depth and precision and different colors and blending colors, as well as more permanence to the artwork. And so all of these lead to these new artistic forms that are then highly sought after by patrons or people who paid for these paintings and sculptures. So we're also going to explore the concept of the Renaissance man, someone who kind of espoused these humanist ideas. The idea of being a Renaissance man is that you don't just specialize in one thing, you have many skills, many different abilities, and you try to perfect as many of them as you can. So a Renaissance man is meant to be educated. They're supposed to be literate, to be able to read and write, and have read the classics, Greek and Roman philosophy, as well as obviously the Bible and other philosophies of their time period. They're supposed to be artistic, either dance, music, poetry, painting, sculpture. They're supposed to have some creative element to their conceptualization. And they're supposed to represent either military prowess through being a soldier or a commander, or physical vigor in some other way. So they are, mind, spirit, creativity, and intellectual knowledge all combined in this concept of a Renaissance man. Kind of one of the greatest examples of a Renaissance man was Leonardo da Vinci, a key artist of this Renaissance period. And he painted, sculpted, and he also did research and furthered the cause of anatomy. He legally would have dead bodies brought to him and dissect them to understand how our muscles and ligaments and tendons flowed together. And again, this was actually against canon law, church law. You're not supposed to do this to human bodies, as mankind is in the form of God. To do so was sacrilegious and blasphemous, so he had to do this secretly. But this allowed him and later people who studied his works a greater knowledge of the human body. And he also developed interesting sketches on like future technologies that wouldn't necessarily come to realization during his time, but might inspire other people to think of ideas. One of his most famous works was Leonardo's Last Supper, which is a fresco. So this means this was painted into essentially wet plaster, like a wall, and then by adding moisture at various times, you can keep this plaster wet enough to continue to work in it in a space of days, weeks, and even months. And this is supposed to represent the Last Supper of Jesus of Nazareth as he sits with his disciples and breaks bread with them and tells them, "Take of this bread, for it is the flesh of me. Take of this wine, for it is my blood," which becomes a central concept in the Catholic ritual of the sacraments. Other inventions include the concept of how the human womb works, and that is where human bodies are gestated. He had an early prototype for a helicopter. He also designed weapons for various lords, including casting of cannons and trying to come up with multiple gun-barreled weapons that didn't really work out, an early form of a tank. but his work would leave a lasting legacy and an impression on Western civilization. Another famous Renaissance artist was Michelangelo. He was a painter, a sculptor, and an engineer. Some of his most famous works that luckily Mr. Campbell has been blessed to be able to see include the Sistine Chapel, which is in the Vatican in Rome, and it depicts all these biblical stories over and over again in incredible detail and beauty, as well as sculptures like La Pieta and David, which is probably one of the more famous works of art of the Renaissance, his specific take on the story of David. La Pieta, again, beautifully carved into a block of pure marble, depicts Mary holding the broken form of Jesus of Nazareth. And again, coming into this idea of the humanity of the things that are divine. I mean, here's Jesus of Nazareth in the Christian theology. He is divine. He is God's incarnate form on earth. And yet, here he's depicted in a very human way the concept that all humans can be brought low, and the suffering of Mary. To Mary, yes, this was God incarnate, but this was also her son that she gave birth to. And here he is, a broken man after being taken down off the cross. And, here you don't see the aspect of uh, Christ Pentecostal, or Christ the divine the divinity. You see him as a man. So very interesting and new ideas and new forms of art that are kind of exploring this concept of mankind and what we are. Raphael, another famous artist of the Renaissance period, he was famous for painting a variety of works in the Papal Palace, including the School of Athens. This is the speech between the Pope who spoke with Attila the Hun and got him to not sack Rome, kind of a huge hallmark, and the power of the Pope's kind of reinvigorated here. Yeah, Mr. Campbell's talking. And while most of our Renaissance artists were men, because quite frankly, doing anything that was a job was considered the province of men alone, there were female Renaissance artists as well, specifically Sonofabispa Anguissola. And she became the personal court painter for Philip II of Spain, who was one of the more powerful rulers in all of Europe, really, during this time period, and painted his family, painted members of his family, and again, the fact that people would have their own family, would have humans, not just biblical subjects painted, again, shows this element of humanism and an embracing of the individual and the individual's achievements on earth. And these are just more examples that are some of the more famous examples of Renaissance art. Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and that shows again this turn to classicism. While quite a bit of Renaissance art shows Christian imagery and Christian theology and moments and actions from the Bible, a lot of it also displays elements of classicism and the stories of the Greeks, the mythology of the Greeks. And this is pretty interesting because you have to remember, like, the theology of the Greeks was dead, right? Roman Catholicism, the Catholic Church, Christianity had dominated and essentially taken over all of Europe in forms of religious society. And yet these Renaissance artists were bold enough to explore themes and concepts from Greece and Roman gods and bring them to life and really use them as symbols to kind of color and view their own world through. One of the most impactful families that almost you could say breathed life into this Renaissance movement and its expansion became really a dynasty in their own right were the Medicis. The Medicis were a very, very powerful banking and political family. They'd actually started out in wool, like with essentially workshops that made and colored wool, and then expanded to become one of the most powerful banking families in all of Europe. They expanded their power. They controlled large portions of Italy. They even got one of their family members elected Pope, Pope Leo X, who evidently enough we'll see again later when we talk about the Protestant Reformation. And they became incredible patrons of the arts. And this kind of represents this idea that what fuels the Renaissance is the growth of trade, the growth of towns and cities, and the commercial revolution. The Medici, specifically Lorenzo Medici, spent the equivalent of almost $500 million in today's money just on art, charity, fountains, buildings, churches, and paying taxes. And this was a way to get people not to hate him as much. He's like, yeah, you can't hate me too much. I painted an entire, or I built a fountain in here. There's my initials in it. But it's a very fascinating example. There's a pretty neat, I think it's on Netflix or Amazon Prime, a pretty cool show on the Medici family as well, showing that as powerful as they are, they also were somewhat corrupt, poisoning their enemies, kind of pressuring people to elect one of their own family members pope who maybe didn't have a real right to be pope in terms of his knowledge of theology and things like that. So definitely a pretty powerful family that illustrates this concept of patronage. What about women in the Renaissance? Well, generally, if we're to read against the grain from diaries and primary sources, the general concept here is that women in the West kind of lost power during the Renaissance. Because of the revival of Greek and Roman ideas and Greek and Roman concepts of patriarchy, you see that women are kind of expected to be charming, pretty, and know stuff, but not know too much. And they're not supposed to show it off. They're not supposed to seek fame or power. Their job was to manage the household staff, do the domestic chores, etc. However, that wasn't true across all social classes. Middle class wives would often help their husbands in the workshops, maybe not doing the menial work itself, but keeping up the workshop, keeping track of accounts, knowing mathematics. And peasant women, well, they had to do work because their families are, barely basically surviving. So it's this kind of interesting concept that when you have social structures such as patriarchy, you generally see it impact the highest classes the most, because they don't have to have their women as equals or as equal workers. So, because those women don't have a working role in society, perhaps that is why they are the focus of losing power and prestige in a Renaissance society, or really any society, whether it's Song China, where you have the foot binding, any number of concepts like that. The Renaissance is also known as an amazing time period of architectural expansion. The common theme you see during the Renaissance is a rejection of the Gothic style of the cathedrals of the High Middle Ages and Middle Ages, and a return to some of the Greek and Roman influences: columns, arches, domes, fountains. And yes, Gothic architecture also includes arches and columns, but they were in a Gothic style. And this is going to be a return to a more classical Greek and Roman style. And these styles became popular because, again, of that rereading of classical Greek and Roman texts, and they would continue to influence modern buildings such as the US Capitol, the Reichstag in Germany, certain imperial styles of art in both France and in Great Britain later on. You see here the famous building of Brunelleschi's dome. This was the largest dome in the world at this time. And it was arguably the largest dome that any European had even undertaken, really anywhere since the creation of the Pantheon in the Roman Empire. And this architect Brunelleschi, he came up with this plan to create honeycombed structures that could support the weight of this massive dome to glorify God and to glorify the church. Even though, unfortunately for his sake, Brunelleschi himself did not live to see the final completion of this dome because it took nearly 100 years to build. But his architectural blueprints allowed it to be built. And the creation of Brunelleschi's dome was funded mostly by contributions, financial contributions of the Medici family. Again, showing that interplay of powerful merchant and banking families with fueling the architectural and artistry of the Renaissance. And again, just more examples of some of the beauty and grandeur that is this architecture that we see in this revival of Greek and classical concepts. You have the pediment, you have these Corinthian style columns here, you have these are more Ionic, if I'm not mistaken, or Doric style columns here in St. Peter's Square in Rome. We also see incredible changes going on in literature during the Renaissance. Now, Latin, the language of the Roman Catholic Church, it did remain a major language, and most writers are going to still write in this because it is the language of the educated people. Like, if you learn how to read and write, typically you did learn how to read and write in Latin first, because one of your first books would most likely be the Bible. But during the Renaissance, we do also see some authors begin to write in the vernacular. I'd like you to star that. It's a concept we're going to see a couple more times here and there this year. That's the everyday language of ordinary people. So for French people or for the people of France, it was French. For England, it was English. For Italian city states, it was Italian. And these Renaissance authors did explore religious subjects like Dante's Divine Comedy, but they also wrote about secular concepts and wrote some of their own stories as well. And we're going to explore a couple of these. One of the most famous is Miguel Cervantes' Don Quixote de la Mancha. This was a story that also focused on a human, right? It focused on his person. There's some church stuff in it, but this is mostly focused on one man's journey, specifically his desire to bring back chivalry as a concept in Europe. And he's kind of an older guy that might be a little senile, but he goes on to try and become a knight of the ancient ways, with mixed results, we'll say. One of the other most famous of these Renaissance authors was Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, he wrote a ton of stuff. I got to read a bunch of his texts in college, which was very interesting, very fascinating. I still have a couple kicking around on my bookshelf. But by far, his most famous text was The Prince. And I'd like you to star that because, you're going to have some questions on this. Let's just be honest. So, The Prince is a relatively aggressive text that is written on how to obtain and hold on to power. And if you read it today, it's a little dark. It's pretty dark in terms of what it says. And one of its biggest arguments is the end justifies the means. That means whatever it takes to achieve your goal, that's acceptable as long as you are successful. So if your goal is to become a prince, a powerful ruler of a minor kingdom or a large kingdom, and you have to kill people, murder people, torture people, as long as you're successful and you unify the people under your control, then you're fine. Like the end, your goal justified the means that you took to get there. And that idea will influence many European thinkers throughout time. And you have some other great quotes. It is much more secure to be feared than loved. And this is what he said of princes. Like, if you can be loved and feared, that's great. But if you can only choose one, you should have your people fear you because that's easier to achieve than being loved by your people. There is nothing more difficult to plan, more doubtful of success, or more dangerous and to manage than the creation of a new system. For the initiator has the enmity of all who would profit by the preservation of the old system, and merely lukewarm defenders and those who'd gain by a new one. And these are utterly fascinating political concepts, and he is a guide to Western political thought, even into today. I mean, like I said, I read The Prince both in high school as part of an honors class, and I also read The Prince in college again. Anyone who's going to be an officer in the military, in most military academies and officer candidate school, you generally read The Prince. Anyone wanting to study political science or law, you're most likely going to read The Prince in college as well because of his arguments and the power of these arguments, whether you agree with them. Some other great quotes from if injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared. Like if you've got to hurt someone or if you've got to tick someone off, you better do it to such a degree that he cannot retaliate against you. Like don't just injure someone and leave them behind where they would plot vengeance against you. Just kill them. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is safer to be feared than loved. Politics have no relation to morals. This is the beginning of a concept we're going to call realpolitik, or the politics of reality. That morality doesn't really come into play when we're talking about power. Power is its own justification. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around them. If he has nothing but fools and sycophants around him, people who just are yes men, will tell him whatever he wants, he's probably not a very intelligent ruler. If he has intelligent people who will question his decisions around him, he's wise enough to realize he doesn't have all the answers. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are. really wild stuff. And I have a copy of The Prince if anyone's ever interested in taking a look at it. It is a very small book. You can breeze through it in basically, I don't know, a couple hours, maybe a day of reading. One of the other most famous authors and a personal favorite of Mr. Campbell is Dante Alighieri. He wrote the Divine Comedy that focuses on Christianity, but it relies on Greek and Roman allusions and figures. And the most famous of this Divine Comedy, because it's broken down into 3 books, is The Inferno. I have like 3 or 4 copies of this on my bookshelf, all different ones. Some are illustrated, some are rhyming poetry, some are non-rhyming. And the Inferno is famous because just everyone loves it. It's wicked cool. I've read several versions of it and took a class on it in college. And it details a symbolic journey into hell. And honestly, he writes with such conviction and power that Dante's like vision of what hell looked like literally defined the European version of hell for centuries, and arguably maybe even to a degree today. And what it was is said that each sin is punished symbolically according to its degree. And he paints a very vivid and fascinating picture of hell. You know, when you talk about demons with pitchforks, like he's the guy that invents that concept in his writing. And I got some different artworks of the various punishments. Those who hoarded money and wasted money are forever pushing these money sack boulders up and down a hill. That's their punishment. You have the blasphemers, those who desecrated the beauty that God wrought. They are either walking, laying, or sitting upon these burning hot sands where hot rain of molten lava hits them. You have the idea of the wrathful, and the suicides are driven through a wood. Suicides are turned into trees that can only speak when their branches are broken. And even Lucifer himself, the devil, is punished in the deepest pit of hell. And he is punished by being frozen half in a block of ice, forever tormented by the pain of that and his immobility against the light of God. One of the other elements that leads to this expansion of writing, both in Latin and in the vernacular, is the spread of universities and knowledge in Western Europe during the Renaissance and after it. After the Renaissance, the desire to learn, the expansion of universities, the expansion of education only increases. And it's a slow increase. Education was not cheap back then. But Europe borrowed ideas and information from the Islamic Golden Age, specifically their focus on elements of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, physiology, and the system of schooling, the madrasas. And they began to emulate those, building the first universities. Universities were groups of scholars, and they would meet initially wherever they could, but eventually they created actual formal schools of education. As far as we know, the first true university, and it still exists today, was the University of Paris, which was founded in 1160, so founded in the 12th century. And these universities in Europe become centers of learning philosophy, law, experimentation, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, all these incredible things. And they then lead to the spreading of technology and ideas. And kind of one of the most famous of these university individuals was Thomas Aquinas. And he took the the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, who like everyone looked up to during this Renaissance time period, or at least all educated people. Your average serf or peasant didn't know who these people were, but educated individuals did. And he says, okay, I'm going to take their philosophy and I'm going to try and use it to basically prove biblical proofs. And he went to school in Italy, Paris, and Germany, showing the spread of these ideas, that he would lecture and study at these different schools, sharing his ideas with others and allowing these ideas to then kind of ferment there and create new ideas, new writings, new individual achievements. The Renaissance eventually spread through trade and cultural diffusion north, affecting northern European nations like Germany, France, Flanders, the Netherlands, and England. And northern humanists were a little bit different. There's a lot of time that has gone by from the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy. You've had the transfer of several hundred years, and they developed this idea of kind of social reform, that their paintings would not just focus on rich individuals or the Bible, their paintings would also focus on daily peasant life, which they thought was not a bad thing. What is the life of your common person? Typically focused on kind of townspeople in smaller towns. And they worked diligently to create photographic detail and create personality and feeling out of their art. And many of them tried to compose or communicate morality through their artwork, which we saw in the Southern Renaissance as well, but generally it was biblical morality. These guys are looking more at just like common reality. And you have fun ones. This is a peasant wedding, so it shows all the things and goings on, dancing and fun and carousing and drinking that would happen during a wedding, just not a rich person's wedding, just a town wedding. Or you have this one, which is called the egg dance, which was a fun game people played where you put eggs all across the floor and people would try to dance all like a jig and not step on eggs. And if you stepped on eggs, that was no good, mostly because you broke a bunch of eggs. So these are examples of this Northern Renaissance art. Again, another element of a feast from a peasant's wedding. You have one of the most famous ones of a newly married couple by Van Eyck. And again, just incredible near photographic realism, considering this is all done with oil paints. And it's of such a level of detail that even into this painting, you can see a mirror in the background, and the mirror reflects the backs of these two individuals. And these paintings represent humanism as well, because this isn't them at church, this is them in their bed chambers, kind of a normally we'd consider a private area. And you can see there's not even fully cleaned up. Like there's some shoes that no one's wearing, there's a dog there, the bed does look made, but it's very much a humanistic painting. They do still depict times of war and conflict and great momentous events, but very much this is reflective and indicative of this Northern Renaissance look at kind of everyday life, or certainly town life, in the life of the burghers. Other examples by Van Eyck to show kind of the incredible patronage and realism. This is the Madonna, and in it, the guy who paid for this painting to be created, Chancellor Rollin, he wanted himself depicted near and praying to the baby Jesus and Madonna, or Mary as it were. And that is this idea of patronage. Like he's like, yeah, I'm paying you lots of money to do this, so paint me in it. Because when I hang this, I want people to see me as a good Christian, to see me glorifying Christ, glorifying the church. I'm such a cool person. And these are just close-ups of this just incredible detail of these columns he painted, the beauty of this crown, the beauty of the actual robes of Madonna, and just intricate detail, all created using these new oil-based paints that were found during the Renaissance. One of my other favorite artists, Albrecht Dürer, who was a German artist, he did paintings, of course, painting of this bunny. He also did a lot of woodblock prints, which is where you etch things into either metal or wood, and then you can create presses of this. I was really, really lucky enough. These are usually held in Europe. I was lucky enough to see this one, which is one of my favorites, in person. It's very, very small. But this is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You have famine, give me a second, famine, war, death, and pestilence. Death, pestilence, famine, war, and they are riding as the seals are broken that will depict the end of times. They are riding over humanity. This is a self-portrait of him. His house is actually still standing in Germany. You can go visit it. I definitely want to before as it were. All right, now we're getting into some nitty-gritty. This is some mas importante stuff here. This is the printing press, which we are going to be talking about really for parts of the rest of the year, and we'll even be talking about it next year. So the printing press is a key technology, a key innovation that is developed in Europe during the Renaissance. Now you're saying, Mr. Campbell, we already talked about the printing press in Tang and Song Dynasty China. You are absolutely right. That's a great observation. But the printing press, while it was invented earlier in China than it was in Europe, it developed independently in Europe. So it wasn't a cultural diffusion thing. The Chinese came up with theirs. They did come up with it earlier, and then the Europeans came up with it. I think it's not an unsafe argument to make that the development of the printing press in Europe might have had a bigger impact on European history than it had on Chinese history, at least in the immediacy. So the impact of the printing press in Europe was felt more quickly then the impact of the printing press was felt in China. So, when we look at technologies, especially if you ever write a technology essay, it is a really important thing to understand, in my opinion, what came before. You should always describe what people were doing or using or what came before so you can clearly show how this technology is different. So before the printing press, books were written or copied by hand. There were people called scribes whose sole job was to write things down. A lot of books were copied by monks in monasteries who that's how they would learn how to read and write, and that's also one of the things they would do in service to God was just copy, read, and print books and preserve knowledge. We talked about that as a key role of the monastic orders during the Middle Ages. So the Europeans developed the first movable type printing press. It is invented by a guy, and I would like you to know his name, Johannes Gutenberg, and this is what we think he looks like based on a woodblock print of him from this time period. We don't have an exact year. We think sometime in the 1440s or in the 1450s. So we're going to say 1450 is a nice cut down the middle in the state of Mainz, Germany. Again, Germany didn't exist as a country yet. It does not exist until 1870. So it's a relatively new-ish kind of country. Mainz was one of the powerful city-states in the Germanic lands. And Gutenberg used his printing press, a movable type printing press where you can arrange the letters around, to create the Gutenberg Bible. And he was able to essentially mass produce these Bibles. And the speed at which you can print words versus the slowness of copying them by hand makes the printing press such a huge and powerful invention. And he starts rolling these off the press, no pun intended, in 1455. There are only 21 of these left in the world, like literally printed by Johannes Gutenberg. There are 21 left in the world. There were hundreds, thousands made while he was alive. And the last one sold for, I think, $27 million. One of the universities, I think the University of Kyoto in Japan, bought one from a private holder for, like I said, I think about $27 million about a decade ago. So if you ever find one of these, like, let Mr. Campbell know and we'll split the difference. I think that sounds fair. So here's where we get to the significance or impact of the printing press, specifically on the West. You want to differentiate this in your writing, whether you look at a Western or Chinese kind of printing press. This is going to be the impact of Johannes Gutenberg's printing press on Western civilization or on European civilization. So you walk you right through it. Because the printing press is more efficient, books become easier and faster to make. When you can make something easier and faster, it becomes cheaper to produce. When something is cheaper to produce, you can sell it for less. It becomes cheaper to buy. So cause and effect, it encouraged people in Europe to read, and literacy rates begin to increase. Now, I'm not saying they went from they were probably about 8-10% literacy in Europe Renaissance. You might be getting into the 15%. It's not going to go to 100% in a year. It's still going to be a slow process. Peasants still generally couldn't read and write. Serfs still generally couldn't read and write. But literacy amongst the middle class will definitely increase. And you'll see a larger and larger percentage of European people be able to read and write until it achieves what it is today with nearly 98% literacy in most of Western civilization today. Cause and effect. New ideas are able to spread very, very quickly. You can write something down and then pay a printer to mass produce your ideas and send them or sell them or distribute them throughout Europe. So this leads to the expansion of medical and scientific texts. New mathematic texts are spread more quickly. The 95 Thesis, which is a key text we'll be talking about next week. And then later on, we get to Enlightenment texts, revolutionary texts, scientific texts. All of these things are able to spread more quickly, increasing the overall knowledge and the rate of knowledge exchange in Europe. I mean, like I said, this is this time period we're starting to see when Europe, which was kind of backwards technologically compared to the Islamic kingdoms or compared to China or even maybe compared to the Gupta dynasty in India, this is the time period, because of this printing press and the Renaissance and the commercial revolution, that Europe starts to catch up and then eventually surpass China, surpass India, and surpass the Islamic world. one of the big impacts of this is the Bible began to be printed in the vernacular. That's, again, the commonly spoken language of any given area, not just Latin. And because the Bible gets printed in the vernacular, more people begin to read the Bible and they begin to have their own ideas on how to interpret it. This will eventually lead, cause and effect, to the Protestant Reformation, which is a huge, huge unit that we'll go into in detail. This is a little project you can do on your own if you want to and submit it to me, but that is our examination of the Renaissance, and thank you so much for joining me.